to a really key document that goes right to the heart of the complex debate over land in Auroville. It's called Public Land Beyond Private Claims, and it puts forward a specific legal and institutional case that's become central to the whole conversation.
You know, at the core of all this, there's this fundamental tension, right? You've got the incredible vision of Auroville as a city for 50,000 people. And then you have the very real and often very emotional debate over the land that's needed to actually build it. This document, well, it doesn't shy away from that debate at all. It confronts it head on.
So let's break down the core arguments of this text. It was written, in its own words, to bring essential clarity to the laws, the mandates, and the facts that surround Auroville's development.
And this quote, right from the introduction, really sets the tone for the entire piece. The stated goal here is to cut through what it sees as mischaracterizations and to ground the whole debate in its own interpretation of Auroville's legal framework.
Okay, so let's get into the real meat of the source's argument. It kicks off by tackling what it calls a fundamental misunderstanding of a specific Indian law and the role of the Auroville Foundation itself.
Now, according to the document, a lot of the confusion comes down to this one act, the RFCTLARR Act of 2013. This is the Indian law that lays out how the state can acquire private land for public projects.
And here's a really critical distinction the document makes. It argues that this specific law is only triggered by compulsory acquisition. That's when the government literally forces a land transfer using eminent domain. The source claims it just doesn't apply to voluntary sales, negotiated exchanges, or the internal organization of land that the Auroville Foundation already owns. So the bottom line, according to this source, is pretty blunt. It asserts that since the Auroville Foundation doesn't have the power of eminent domain and is dealing in voluntary exchanges, the rules and compensation packages of this specific act just don't apply to what it's doing.
The source goes even further. It argues that it's not just the law itself, but also the words being used that are getting mixed up. It states that under the Act, resettlement is a legal term that comes with a statutory compensation package for landowners. But in the Auroville context, it argues, residents are permissive occupants on foundation land. So relocation simply means being given an alternative place to live, not legal resettlement as defined by the Act.
Okay, so moving on from that specific law, the document's next major argument shifts focus. It zooms in on how public purpose and public authority are defined and used within Auroville's legal framework.
According to this document, public purpose isn't some vague idea or a matter of popular opinion. It's something explicitly defined by the legal mandate of the Auroville Foundation Act. And that purpose, it says, is to build the city according to the master plan.
And that number, 50,000, is really important here. The document emphasizes that this public purpose is for a planned city of 50,000 people. It argues that decisions have to serve this much larger, future-focused goal, not just the preferences of the roughly 2,000 adults who are living there right now. This line of reasoning leads directly to the document's interpretation of the Residents' Assembly's role. It asserts that under the Auroville Foundation Act, the Assembly's function is advisory. According to this source, it simply does not hold a legal veto power over the implementation of the master plan. All right, this next point is a really core distinction the document is trying to make. It's about the difference between the act of caring for the land, what it calls stewardship, and the actual legal right of ownership. The source argues that these two ideas are often blurred together. It states that yes, long-term residents, taking care of the land, and having an emotional investment, that's all stewardship. But it maintains that those actions don't legally convert a conditional occupation into ownership, and they don't grant someone the power to override the city's approved plan. So after laying out its interpretation of the legal side of things, the document, well, it shifts gears pretty significantly. It moves away from clarifying what it sees as legal rights and starts talking about what it frames as the responsibilities of the residents. This question right here marks a very clear turn in the narrative. The focus moves from what you might call a defensive legal explanation to a more assertive commentary on the community's role and conduct in the city's development as the source sees it.
And here's where the document puts forward its own claims about the motivations behind the opposition. It alleges that resistance comes from two main places. First, just a general resistance to the practical, hard work of building the city. And second, an attempt by some to reclaim influence they might have lost as land arrangements have become more transparent.
And that brings us to the final section. This is where the document summarizes its overarching message and its perspective on the right path forward for Auroville's development.
The source really boils its conclusion down to a few core principles. It argues that while development might cause discomfort, and it definitely brings change, those things don't automatically mean something illegal or unjust is happening. It frames the implementation of the master plan not as a betrayal of Auroville's ideals, but as the fulfillment of a fundamental responsibility.
And the document concludes with this very direct and affirmative statement, essentially reframing the events of recent years as a necessary and perhaps even destined intervention to push the city's development forward.